So I'm going to start today by circling back to the things that I sent for you to do when when I wasn't able to do the class last time. So I want to make sure that everyone has the correct answers because all of these events and history are so linked that I need you to have a good understanding of all of these things before we head into World War II. Before I begin, I want to say I did forget to publish the discussion that it mentioned in the assignment this week to make sure that you do. I have published that discussion now, and I gave you an additional week to do that. So next week is spring break, so I made it where you didn't have any work to do that week. So you'll see it's a extended due date, and it doesn't really match the following assignment, but that was just because I forgot to hit the publish button, which I apologize for that. Okay, so let's go back to the causes of the Russian Revolution. So we're talking about the early 1900s now, or late 1800s. We're just making a little backward circle. And during that time, Russia was under the type of government that was controlled by czars. The word CZAR, TSAR, TZAR, they're all the same thing, and they're a dictator in Russia. It's actually from the same root word as a Caesar. So it was the Romanov dynasty with Tsar Nicholas in control at this time. So most of the people in Russia were poor farmers. And actually, I'm going to go down to a different page here. I know you have all these pages. Okay, but let's look right here. And it's a very agricultural society, but Russia has a very cold climate. And so most of them are very poor. It's not, and it's also not a lot of land ownership divided up among the people. Serfdom was very prevalent in Russia at this time, which meant that wealthy people owned land, people farmed the land for them, and were subject to those wealthy people. Serfdom is abolished in the late 1800s, but that practice of those people not being really prosperous and not having the same opportunities as the upper class continues. So when Nicholas II takes rule in 1884, he continues this kind of autocratic rule, meaning that he was a very strong dictator, basically. He increases the industrial production, but at the same time, the large class of poor people increases. And these people become increasingly urban during the Industrial Revolution, which means we've got a movement of this former serf class that still is not being advanced in society, no opportunities, that now move to urban areas to try to change their situation. However, in this industrialization in Russia that Nicholas prompts, they are actually very poorly mistreated. They work very long hours. They get very little pay. And so what they do is they want to create a document or a petition to go to the czar to simply ask for better treatment, better pay. So the reason I want to show this is because you see this little picture here, which is a drawing. But when they go to the palace to give this petition to the czar, he is not there. The general who is in charge in the czar's absence says to his guards, open fire on these people. So 500 unarmed people coming to bring a petition just to beg for less hours and more pay were all killed. And this becomes known as Bloody Sunday. It's a January of 1905. So we've really circled back. We're before World War I right now. So this is just to help you understand how all of this is linked. Okay, so then we've got 1905 here. Sorry, don't mean to make you dizzy. We go all the way to 1914 and World War I begins. At this time, Russia enters in with the French and the British. That's who they choose to have allies with. And we talked about this before of this big system of alliances. Russia has a separate agreement with the country of Serbia. We talked about that, talking about that this is what led to World War I, because when the Archduke of Austria is killed by a Serbian terrorist that brings them into war with Austria because of Russia's treaty with Serbia, it by default brings Russia into the conflict. This whole series of events we've already gone over is what brings the world into war because of all of those alliances. Serbia looks to Russia for help. Nicholas agrees to back Serbia against war with the Austrians. Okay, so interestingly, that isn't really a thing anymore, is Nicholas takes command of his army in 1914, and he is out on the battlefield with his army. So he has left the palace for a very extended amount of time. So just because World War I has begun and Nicholas is being this strong leader going on the battlefield does not at all change the circumstances that are going on in Russia. In Russia still exists the massive poverty of the urban working class, and there's still that stain on the government for killing all the unarmed workers simply for going in with a petition. So during all of this turmoil, over 15 million men are drafted into the Russian army from these farms and factories. So they're already low paid, disgruntled workers. And now we're pulling 15 million workers out of that system and leaving those factory jobs basically empty. So production is way down. Nicholas goes out on the field. Okay, so what happens when the Tsar goes out on the battlefield? Well, it's left to the control of his wife, Tsarina Alexandra. So Tsarina Alexandra and many of the Russian nobility, because they married relatives to keep the bloodline pure, there were genetic illnesses that developed because of that. And so one of those illnesses that plagued the Russian royal family was hemophilia. That's a disease where you lack the clotting ability. If you're cut in a small cut, you could bleed to death. So she has a son, Alexei, who has this hemophilia. And so he is kept like, constantly has to lay in bed and lay still. We don't want to bump anything. He would bruise very badly with a small bump. And so she begins to fall under the influence of this man, Rasputin. One time, Alexei is ill, and Rasputin comes to the palace and lays hands on him, not as like a Christian prayer, but lays hands on him, and he begins to get better. And the Tsarina begins to believe that Rasputin has the power to heal, and she falls under his influence and begins having like other Russian nobility to come and try to grow their faith in this Rasputin character. And so the rumor is that the Tsarina is having an affair with Rasputin. However, it doesn't stop there. She encourages the wives of the other nobility that are there in the capital to also have this affair with Rasputin, because they believe that then his good faith and the power of his good faith will extend to their families. Well, of course, all of the husbands of all these females grow a deep hatred of this Rasputin guy. But it doesn't just extend into like this, like she thinks that he is healing her son. She begins to seek his guidance on political powers, and shares with him like military operations of the Russian army and things that are going out on the battlefield. So this just, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble this morning. I think I need to drink a little sip of my coffee. Let me try to put my thoughts together. Not only are the nobility, the husbands and these wives, develop a deep hatred over him because of his affairs with all of their wives, but also because he is being given political information and military information that the Tsarina is not sharing with them. And so he becomes this incredible enemy of the men in Russia. And so they decide that they are going to kill Rasputin. So let me go back up here. Yes, okay. So this man is very difficult to kill, which kind of alludes or encourages the belief that he has these magical powers. He is poisoned, he is stabbed, and he is shot. Before they finally find him, still barely alive, so they throw him in the river to make sure he is dead. So it really takes an effort to kill this Rasputin. So why this story? Well, it's kind of an interesting story, but again, it speaks to the amount of turmoil and confusion and lack of leadership that is in the country of Russia during World War I. This does not end the Russian workers' discontent. So let's go down to the next story. So the workers began a series of revolutions in March of 1917, right in the midst of World War I. Nicholas is away leading the war. St. Petersburg, everyone is still discontent, and workers begin to strike. Huge problem for Russia, because already 15 million workers are pulled out of the factory system. Production is already down. Now those workers that are left begin to strike. The soldiers themselves begin to desert their posts and join the strikes. So Nicholas has to begin some reform movements. Leaders around the world are telling him, you need to begin some reforms, try some democratic change, or you're going to lose your country. Rioters are stealing what food supply is left. Troops are refusing to keep order. And they eventually are able to go into the palace and take the Tsar's wife and children as prisoners. The Tsar himself is forced to abdicate. Abdicate means that he willingly signs a document to give up his power. So the Imperial Duma, or the Dumas, takes control of Russia. This is a governing body. Can't really liken it to Congress because they're nothing like Congress, but in the respect that it is a large group of people in a country that are the governing body. That's the only kind of link I can make. Something like a parliament. But they temporarily take control, and the Tsar, as he is abdicating, he gives power to his brother, the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. So this is just a mess. And so think of it as if you are this brother and you're the czar whose family is prisoner because everyone hates the czar and wants reform, and his brother is supposed to walk into this mess. Well, he doesn't really want to walk into there because he's fearful, like, yeah, I'm going to walk in there and the first thing they're going to do is murder me. So he refuses to take the throne. And so that's why they have to set up this temporary or provisional government, these people who are leading all these revolutions. And so the Dumas is reinstated and they choose leaders. It's very difficult because there's so much chaos and no one agrees on what should be done. You've got 100 people with 100 different opinions. So it's very difficult to establish a strong leadership in this provisional government. So there's governing body, and then there's groups of people who kind of bind together over their beliefs of what should be done. And so it ends up dividing into two main groups, the Bolsheviks, the red Bolsheviks and the white Bolsheviks, basically. So the Bolsheviks are communist followers of Karl Marx. So Karl Marx writes this document. I'm pretty sure we talked about this. And he writes the Communist Manifesto, which is we did talk about the rights of the proletariat, the rights of the workers, and that the workers need to come together and with violence take over governments that are mistreating them. And so the gap between the rich and the poor in Russia is huge. There's not a middle class. It's super wealthy or super poor. And so there's a little bit of leftover of that now that you can see in the news if you watch the news about what's going on with Ukraine. And I'm hoping today this will make some connections for you of what's going on now and where it really came from in the past. And there's a lot of talk right now of these Russian oligarchs around the world who are being sanctioned. They're super wealthy. They have a great amount of influence on Putin because of their wealth. And they can force decisions from Putin. So this idea now that if they're going to be sanctioned or their money and assets are frozen, they will encourage Putin to make decisions. Well, this is not a new thing in Russia. Back here, we've got these very wealthy people that can force the leader of Russia to make decisions because they have all the financing for that leader. And so it's kind of like a big group of people with massive amounts of wealth pushing the leader to make decisions that favor them. And so that leaves a huge gap between them and the very poor people. And those are the people who are starting revolutions in Russia right now. So Vladimir Lenin is the leader of the Bolshevik Party. He represents a great threat to the Tsar. So he was originally exiled to Western Europe. But if you remember, Russia entered the war on the side of Britain and France. Germany is their enemy. So Germany sees profit or a way to gain an edge in the war by getting Lenin back into Russia. So he helps, or he, not he, the country of Germany helps Lenin sneak back into Russia and encourage this Bolshevik takeover in Russia. And so as he comes back in, one of the ways, and we'll go into the dictators that you watch videos about and read about as well. So one of the things that really enables a dictator to come into a country is when a country is in such bad shape that they come in and they say, everyone here is doing a bad job. That's why we are in the state that we were in. Here's what I promise. He promises three things: peace, land, and bread. So into the war, the land is basically a promise of a middle class, if you think about it, because the only people who have power are these wealthy oligarchs. Then you've got these poor workers. So if you can get these poor workers a little piece of land, which equates to political power and wealth, and then you can have bread or you have food. We're no longer starving. So in 1917, Lenin and his followers began to take over St. Petersburg, which this provisional government, which really did not have a strong leadership to begin with because of conflict, it is easily overthrown and the Bolsheviks take charge of Russia. It immediately leads to a civil war. Like I mentioned a minute ago, we've got the red Bolsheviks and the white anti-Bolsheviks. I think I forgot to say anti. So we've got a civil war of instant making when they take over, of those who are for it and those who are against it. Lenin is a very strong leader, has a very strong following who have been oppressed for so long that out of desperation, they blindly follow him. So one of the first things that happens is we have an overthrown government and we have a collapse of the economy. So that's a little bit of what is going on right now in Russia, is a collapse of their economy. So the war effort, now this is different from the current situation. The war effort at this time is what caused the collapse of the economy. It's so expensive to fight an extended war across the continent, and it's nearly at collapse. I've mentioned multiple times the factory's very low production because of the men who had to go away to war and then the strikes. So Lenin feels like the only way that he can come in and take control of this country and regroup and get things pulled back together is by pulling out of World War I. So he meets with the former enemies. He doesn't want to meet with the people that the country is allies with. So Lenin was not allies with England and France. That was the Tsar. Lenin now meets with Austria, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire and signs a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans, Austrian, and Ottoman Empire. Now he's so anxious to pull out of the war and establish his control in Russia that he willingly gives up some territory: Poland, Finland, and Ukraine. So here we go. Here's what's linking it to today. He gives up Ukraine at this time to pull out of the war, and Russia turns within, Lenin turns within to establish the control in his country. Now, he never loses sight of the fact that he wants that territory, but he's willing to give it up temporarily to turn inward and establish a strong control. All right, so who's his biggest threat? Well, the biggest threat are these families that have the wealth that can work together with the Tsar to bring the Tsar back to power. So what has to be done is the elimination of those threats. So the Tsar and his family have been kept in house arrest since 1918. I'm sorry, since 1917, excuse me. In 1918, when the Bolsheviks take power, they talk of putting Nicholas on trial. But during that process, remember we have the white anti-Bolsheviks. They are thinking, let's look back at history when you have very profound people getting ready to go on trial with followers, those followers can come in and try to help them escape. So they fear that that's what's going to happen here. And they said, oh no, the Tsar and his family have to die tonight. So this place that they're being kept under house arrest, they're taken into the basement along with their maids, their butlers, their dogs, their pets, everything. They are taken down into the basement and they are shot. Not only are they shot, after they are shot, and there's the story that one of the sons was still moaning, so they would have shot him again. Then they cover their bodies with acid and then throw them down a well. So very horrific death. Now there is the theory that Anastasia, sorry, the name left me, was holding her dog in the basement when she was shot, and the bullets themselves went through the dog and did not kill her, and that one of the workers there in the palace pulled her aside and helped her escape. And there's a Disney movie, Anastasia. There's lots of movies about this theory, so you know, if you're interested in that, you can go check them out. But the Tsar and his family are executed and thrown down a well. There's a picture here of the basement where they are shot. So after this is done, over the next 4 years, Lenin continues to establish his power. So with that, he needs to reestablish a lot of factories to feed this massive amount of people. This is a very large land mass. He wants to extend his control into several of the smaller countries. So when we finish talking about World War II, and we'll go into talking about the Cold War, which comes after that, and we'll really revisit this at this time. But in 1922, he extends his power into Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. He takes control of all of these small countries. And he forms the United Soviet Socialist Republic, or USSR, or Soviet Union. The word Soviet is a word that represents those workers. So never, never, never is communist about prosperity for all. Communism is always about the worker having rights, the worker having equality with everyone, and the worker being taken care of. So there's limitations to that, which the world begins to see in communism, that there's still a very wealthy few elites that have control over the distribution of this equality. So in 1923, the Russian Civil War between the Red Bolsheviks and the White anti-Bolsheviks is over. The White Army has been aided by nationalists such as Ukraine. There is a link to today of this hostility between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine helped fight and fund the white anti-Bolsheviks. The US, the French, and the British, all of those for a time help the anti-Bolsheviks. But eventually, the red Bolsheviks, I'm sorry, I keep saying that, the white anti-Bolsheviks, the red Bolsheviks eventually do end up solidifying their power and their control over Russia. The communist takeover. Over 15 million people have died. Additional 5 million died in World War I. There is a lot of devastation in Russia. The country is almost in near ruin. There's famine, there's drought, And then, of course, the 1920s, the worldwide depression only makes things worse. So there is a really bad situation in Russia, but Lenin continues to hold that grip. We'll talk about this more when we talk about Stalin and the use of a police force to instill his power by terror. Lenin has a large amount of followers, but he has a large amount of enemies as well. So there's several assassination attempts on his to take him out of power. At one time, he is actually shot in the jaw, I think it is. Yeah, the jaw and the neck. It's too risky. You know, they don't have the same medical technology that they do now. It's too risky to try to operate. So the bullet is left. His health begins to decline, and he does eventually die in 1924. And a new leader comes into Russia, Stalin, which we will talk much more about when we get into the Cold War. Or actually, we're getting ready to talk about him again with the rise of the dictators. But what I want to say about Lenin is this is so bizarre. Um, his body is literally put on display in a glass coffin after he is preserved, and it becomes a tourist attraction. The most visited tourist attraction in Russia are people going to see the body of Lenin. So very, very bizarre how strong his leadership is. And the following of him is either so intense in support or so intense in hatred. All right, so let's move on. And I have another document here that I want to pull up. Just give me a minute, and I'm actually going to pull up the answer key just for the sake of time, because there's so much to cover today, because I really want to make sure you have the benefit of lecture on all the things that we've talked about. Come on, hit the button. There we go. Or all the things that I did not talk about when I was traveling last time. All right, so after World War I mentioned to you before in a previous lecture about the state of Germany and the rate of inflation being so intense that they had to pay their workers like every few minutes to keep up with the rate of exchange. They ended up having to scrap it and having to start all over. Germany itself is just in a state of disaster after World War I, and all the treaties that blamed everything on them, that left them owing money to the world, but taking away their ability to make money and taking away their army and their military and their ships and their equipment. So this is a situation that opens a door for a dictator to come in. And take a drink, sorry. So at this time is the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. He writes a book or paper, for lack of better words, called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And he spends time in prison for going around and speaking these ideals. And he begins to preach several different things as he's going around and getting support for these ideals. One, he begins to, what is the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry, I'm not quite awake. He begins to instill in the people that the Jewish people are responsible for the losses to the true German race, that they have stolen their money, they have stolen their inheritances, they have stolen their wealth, they have taken their businesses. A lot of people say that he wanted to be an artist and he had a Jewish art instructor who told him he had no talent. And that was the beginning of his hatred for the Jewish people. But whatever the reason was, he begins to lead the people. He's a very good orator, meaning he gives great speeches that the Jews are the cause of all of Germany's problems. And what we need to do is we need to, as Germans, come back together and purify our race. Germans only marry Germans. And if we are all just marrying each other, we will be the super race, the Aryan race, which came, and I remember telling you this, back in India, when India was developing the caste system, the Aryans were the ones who were at the top. And there was this belief that the lighter your skin, the lighter your hair, the more superior you are, which is funny because if you look at Hitler, he has dark hair and dark eyes, but doesn't have dark skin. But, that's where this all came from. And so he professes this ideology around Germany and he begins to get supporters, which is not difficult to do because Germany is in such a state of despair. So he wants to rid Germany and the rest of Europe of the Jews because he is saying they're the reason for all of our problems. He's like, we can hate these people who made this treaty from World War I that caused all this, but really the cause is the Jew people. But Germans, he says, are the superior race, and all German people should have the lands given back to Germany so that everybody who is German is living in the boundaries of Germany. So he wants to take back all those lands taken away by the Treaty of Versailles. He also wants to conquer the Soviet Union. So it's really important that you remember that fascists and Nazis and communists are not at all friends. They are enemies. And so even today, when people who are fighting for reforms that are in the socialist and communist direction, they will often call the people in current leadership Nazis, because that's at this time where this is developed, the Nazis and the fascists. So also remember that Nazism is fascism in Germany. So fascism is extreme nationalism and militarism. That's at its core. That is what Nazism and fascism is. They are extremely nationalistic, the superior race. They are extremely militaristic, meaning we will fight for our race. Communism is very different. Communism always has been and always will be the rights of the workers. We're not about prosperity to become wealthy. We're about the rights of the workers. So now when you see things where they will call people Nazis, Trump was often called a Nazi. It is seen that he is fighting for the rights of some race that is superior. And then the socialists and the communists are fighting for the rights of all the common workers, regardless of race. So I hope that helps you see where this is developed at this time and what that means today. They are nothing alike. And so he wants to conquer the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union, of course, is the appeal of the worker. No superior race. No one is superior. Okay, so what were his obstacles and his problems? And we're really going to get into this the next time. When he does invade the Soviet Union, that is really the beginning of his downfall in World War II. But what we're really going to focus on right now is his problems, is he did become successful in the genocide of the Jewish people, and not just the Jewish people, that is the majority, but also the anybody who had any type of handicap or any race that he felt was inferior. So a lot of, like in Eastern Europe, the Gypsy people in Romania and that area, those also were people included in his genocide. But he wasn't able to eliminate all of them, because when the US did enter the war, they liberated the Nazi death camps. Okay, one of his friends is Benito Mussolini, and we will talk about this more in World War II. So I'm just touching on this today. He is a fascist in Italy. So again, this is extreme nationalism and militarism. He takes control of Italy. So Italy and Germany are the two countries that became countries late in the game. They did not come together and nationalize until the 1900s. So he takes control, he rebuilds Italy's economy, and his claim is that he's going to return Italy to the grandeur of the former Roman Empire. And he also needs to invade some lands, and we'll talk about this in World War II. He goes into Ethiopia, and the Allies really began to conquer his claims and his foreign invasions, which causes the people to lose faith with him. We'll talk about what ends up happening to him, because it's not a very good scenario. And then the last one, going back to where we just finished with Lenin, this other dictator is Joseph Stalin. So he is one of the cruelest leaders in all history. He comes into power after Lenin, wants to create a classless society. Very different than Hitler. I need you to make sure you understand that. Hitler's a superior race. That is not classless. That is a superior class and an inferior class. Stalin takes ownership of all property in the Soviet Union. So there's no homes, there's no businesses, there's nothing that you can own as private property. And the reason for this is because if the government owns everything, they will distribute it so that we have no classes, we have no social classes. He keeps control through his secret police force. Anybody who opposes him is executed. He makes the Soviet Union a superpower because he expands the empire militaristically. So they have an alliance at one time with Germany. Hitler made that alliance completely as a lie and ends up invading them. But he's so cruel, he makes very poor military decisions. He executes his own people because he has this, he's constantly thinking that they're all against him. And he really loses all support of the Allies. So all of this kind of comes into play with all of his obstacles and his problems. Again, we will circle back to this in World War II. So I know I had so much to go over today. I'm so sorry. It's so much. I do have one more. Let me pull it up. That we're going to, where is the thing? Here we go. Okay, let me go here first. So you should have that I put in an email to please make a copy of this. It's just the fall of the Ottoman Empire questions. So I'm going to go over this and you will get the questions by default. You know what? If you are watching this in a video or Kari watching this live, you can make a screenshot of this right now to make sure that you have the correct answers, because you will need to know this stuff. So this is also like pulling together those pieces after World War I, and how does that lead to World War II? So we've gone over the dictators, now we're going over nationalism. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll go over nationalism, go over the fall of the Ottoman Empire. All right, so there were some definitions at the beginning. This is a super quick overview. What is an empire? A group of states or countries under the control of a supreme authority. A strong country gathers in some smaller countries and takes control. The Ottoman Empire was an empire that controlled much of Southwest Asia until the end of World War I. Again, you can take screenshots if I'm going too fast. Partitioning, real simple definition of that, chopping up of a country into separate nations. We've touched on this before, why this is a problem, because it doesn't recognize ethnicities and large groups who do not get borders around them. They get divided in those borders. Imperialism, extending the authority of an empire over foreign countries. And mandates. A mandate's when you're assigned a territory to take charge of. England mandated control of India. Okay, don't really have time to go over this, but you know, when you look at these pictures and thinking of the Middle Eastern history and territory, these pictures to me instantly make you think of conflict. And that's what's going on here. There's just constant conflict. Okay, but let's get back into here. So the Ottoman Empire begins way back in 1299. You talk about circling back. This goes way back. By 1500, you can look at the map here at how much control they have of the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean, down into Africa. So they are very, very powerful. They're known for their ruthless pursuit of land. Other empires, though, began attacking them and fighting, and the empire loses land and begins to fall at the end of World War I. Okay, so I'm not going to do this because I've got to pick up my pace a little bit. Let me stop just for 1 second. So Kari, if you're here, I'm going to stop recording for a minute. I need to take just like a 2-minute break. I'm going to run to the restroom and get a drink, and then I will pick right back up. So you can take a break now if you're watching, but I'm going to stop recording and I will quick break, be right back. All right, so let's pick back up here with the Ottoman Empire. So during World War I, the Ottoman Empire was on the side with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So back at the very first slide, when there was a picture of the map, let's do it here again, of how much land they had gained with their military pursuits. Some of those countries began fighting back to regain their land from the Ottoman Empire. So during World War I, the Ottomans joined the war, and one of the reasons is they're hoping to regain some of that land they had lost. They end up challenging the British control of the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal is the little piece of land. Let's see if I can find a picture here. So here's the Mediterranean. Here in the light tan color, where it says Turkey, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. present-day Turkey. This is the Ottoman Empire. Down below where you see Egypt and Africa, the Suez Canal is the canal that opens up a waterway from the Mediterranean Sea through Egypt, right there. Okay, so which slide was I on? Here we go. No, this one. So they want to challenge the British for that. The British have control of that at this time. But the Ottoman Empire ends up on the losing side of World War I, and the empire collapses. So when that happens, several countries have to come in and try to reestablish order in the region. So France is given Syria, Lebanon, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. When I say this sentence right away, I hope it triggers with you instantly, this is a problem. You can't give a country another country and expect there not to be an issue. Britain takes control of Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, and part of Saudi Arabia. And Turkey remains independent. That's one of the questions, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so in 1917, the war is over. France and Britain agree how to divide up the Ottoman Empire. Why did they get to do it? They won the war. And so the Ottomans and the rest of the Central Powers who lost get some consequences. The government of the Ottoman Empire is ended. Turkey is created. There's your independent country. All the land that was under the Ottomans was given to France and Britain, and they partition the Middle East into new countries. It is at this time that they create Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. So when another country creates new countries, they have their reasons for where they put borders, and most often they're going to benefit the country creating the borders. The people within those borders aren't really given much say where they are, and that's where we have some conflict. So Great Britain heavily influences the governments that are put in control in these territories, and they remain under British supervision for years. So what becomes Israel in 1948 is actually under the mandate of the British for quite some time. As you can see here, it is in red. Okay, and many Middle Eastern nationalist groups are not given independence like they were promised. So the problems created by this land division have just persisted into today. Modern history, we can learn of like genocide and wanting to eliminate certain ethnic groups because they're in our borders. And it goes back to this time. Unfortunately, they drew borders without considering those tribes, the religious groups, the ethnic groups. They're all forced under one government, and none of the Arab countries were consulted about the division. So you don't need to know this map. But the purpose of showing you this map, and you can't see the key, I'm sure, because it's so small, but is the variety of the colors. Each color signifies an ethnic group. Well, ethnic groups tend to like to be together, and they like to have a say in the government of the borders that they are in. Okay, so there's diplomats, Sir Mark Sykes and Francois something Georges Picot of France, Britain and France. They are setting the boundaries of the Middle East. So I think that is right here, number 3 on your sheet. Now I gotta find which one I was on. Sorry. Move. Okay. So they meet in secret to create an agreement, which is given their names, that that is developing these borders. They ignore the complicated histories of all of these tribes and ethnic groups and religious groups where they've been living for centuries. So some of the main groups that are affected by this are the Turks, the Arabs, the Kurds, the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews. Those are some big groups. Okay, and conflict begins. That is no surprise, is it? None of the Middle Eastern countries wanted Europe in charge of them. The conflict created by this partitioning still creates conflict today. Great Britain and France really wanted immediate control in order to control the oil profits. So remember when I said the countries who are given the authority to draw borders will often draw those borders in a way that benefits them. So they draw up these borders so that they can have control of the oil profits, and claims of over the land continue to lead to bloodshed. It's just never ended. And things that we're not even seeing in our news today, but from 1980 to 1988, Iran and Iraq fought a war over oil. So interestingly, we today often just think of the Muslims as a united group. We've got the Muslims against the Christians, against the Jews, etc. But if you think back to when we talked about the formation of the religion of Islam after the death of Muhammad, it quickly divided into two sects, S-E-C-T-S, the Sunni and the Shia. This is the reason for the conflict between Iran and Iraq. You can see on the map here on the right, the Iraqis are Sunnis and the Iranians are Shias. There's also another group called the Kurds. The Kurdish ethnic group is all in brown here. So look at the division, the borders goes right through their ethnic group. They are not given a territory. They are put into 4 territories. So right here, we've got 2 big conflicts. Okay. So how are the Kurds impacted? They did not get their own territory. They're divided among 4. And what that did was that set up, so let's look right here, the Kurds, all of this area on the map in the left where the brown bleeds into the country of Iraq. Well, when Saddam Hussein comes into power, he doesn't want the Kurds in his border. That's his country. So he embarked on something similar to Hitler. He wanted to eliminate them, and it was a form of genocide. They still have a civil war in Syria. Let's look back here. Syria, this area of Syria. So the fact that they were never given their own border, not only was it bad for them as a whole, but all the countries that they were divided up into don't want them there. So it's a lot of suffering has gone on. Where am I? I think I pretty much answered that question already. And so you can look here that the Sunnis are the largest group in the Middle East, but when you've got the Shia, here we're going to constantly have conflict between these 2 groups. Okay. Let my dog up. I can keep talking. So we can easily say, and it's not just the Shia and the Sunnis, but it's also then the Jewish people into this conflict in this region as well. So disputes over religion are really the heart of the conflict here. So conflicts occur within the Muslims, and as a result of the partitioning of the Middle East, they are often within the religion of Islam rivals with each other because they're being forced to get along. They fought for decades over power in this region. So look at this map here. This is another huge source of conflict as the Ottoman Empire was divided up. This is actually what is Israel today, as you can see on the far right. So originally, when there's British mandates, this is considered Palestinian land. There's a Palestinian Liberation Organization that we'll talk about comes into power, the PLO. But the Palestinians are not Jewish people. There's a difference, don't think of Palestine because, we'll say in Palestine, associating that with Jewish people, but the Palestinians are not Jewish. They are the Muslim. They have land here, and you can see on the far left in 1947 in white, it's very small Jewish settlements. Those began to grow, and it develops into 1948, becomes a country of Israel, still with Palestinian settlements within the borders. It's going to have conflict right there. They all want this little strip of land. It's so small, but they all have claim to it for their religious reasons. This is considered a very sacred land for three religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So in 1948, the United Nations, sorry, I hope I gave you a little smile, caught your attention maybe, partitions Palestine into Israel and the Arab Muslim state of Palestine. The Palestinians refused to recognize Israel as a nation. As a matter of fact, until President Trump, the world refused to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel because everybody had claim to it as being sacred, and it was Tel Aviv. And then Trump says, no, we will now recognize that. So you can see where this is all considered conflict over religion that just never has been resolved. So the Palestinians get help from other Arab countries: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, and they've been in conflict with the Israeli for decades. There is a particular small strip of land called the Gaza Strip that both lay claim to. They both say it is sacred. So I think I can hear, okay. So I think that was one of your questions, right? The Balfour Declaration. Okay, it's not. There is a British person who makes this declaration that Israel will get a country. You do not have to write. And so Britain, they're given this mandate of this region after World War I, and they are originally the ones who end up declaring it as a nation in 1948. All right, so we got a couple more things to go over. It is so much. I know. Sorry. Is it this one? I think it is. All right. So this nationalism continues to spread around the world. I will not be able to go over every detail in the chapter because of time, but I'm going to hit as much of this as possible. So let's talk about nationalism around the world. Okay, sorry. So at the end of World War I, and we've talked about imperialism and the carving up of Africa. This is just a colorful picture to show you how much of Africa has been colonized by the European nations. Ethiopia, that little gray area on the right, left alone. The Great Depression spreads worldwide in the 30s. and nationalist and anti-imperial movements began to gain strength. So let's talk about Japan, because this is super important in World War II. Nationalism in Japan. They're looking to build up their strength. They build up their military. They want to expand their empire in the 20s and the 30s. 1931, you can look at the map down in the bottom right. They want to invade the Manchuria region of China. So they blow up a railroad and blame it on the Chinese and use that as a reason to invade. That's called the Mukden Incident in 1931. The League of Nations, we talked about this after World War I. United States doesn't join, even though Wilson came up with the idea. They condemn the actions, and with Japan actually withdraws from the League. So this really is the point of the beginning of their aggression. That's a factor in World War II. So the United States is not in the League, but they do have multiple embargoes set in place against Japan, where they aren't allowed to buy this, or they won't buy this from Japan. All right, and then there's China. Picking up the pace here a little bit, because I feel like I've really talked for a long time. But in 1911, before World War I, the Qing dynasty collapses in a revolution. And so it's been 2,000 years of dynasties in China. And finally, that cycle of all power being given to dynasties is broken. Sun Yat-sen leads a nationalist movement. The definition just keeps coming back to us. What is a nationalist? Is a person who has an extreme pride in their ethnicity and country. So the Chinese youth and intellectuals who oppose imperialism, and the response that allowed Japan to get some of Chinese colonies, start a movement. So in 1922, there's 2021, excuse me, a groups that emerge in China. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know how to say that other word, so we're just going to call it the Nationalist Party. So what are the differences here? So communism, that is government takeover of all personal and private property, so we can have a classless society and distribute things among the workers. It's about equalizing the working class by someone taking complete control. No one's allowed to be like the billionaires we have. No one's allowed to have a company like Bezos and build an Amazon, because we can't have that unequal distribution among the workers. So there's two rivals here. We've got that. Then we've got the Nationalist Party. Nationalists are all about our race and recognizing the ethnicity, the superiority, and militaristically supporting that race. So I hope you're understanding those differences. So when Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, a civil war breaks out between the two groups. Now, Kai-shek is what we'll refer to him, Chiang Kai-shek. He is the leader of the nationalists. Mao Zedong leads the communists. Now, Kai-shek is actually supported by the United States, by all the democratic nations, because democratic capitalist nations are opposed to communism. So they send weapons, etc., and they really help to support the nationalists. Mao Zedong leads what is called the Long March. the retreat of the communists in 1935. Oh, I just realized I forgot to mention that you do have a note sheet that you should be filling out. So if you need to take screenshots or whatever here, but this map is an arrow showing this long march, the retreat of the communists. Oh, wait. All right, so this retreat is not like an admittance of failure. It is actually a regrouping. And so we know that Mao Zedong eventually wins and defeats the nationalists, and they take all of that weapons and support given by the democratic nations to the nationalists. They end up, when they win, they take all of those weapons and supplies that were given. Okay, so let's talk about India really quickly. There's a mandate after World War I. Britain is in India. Britain has had a long relationship with India, an imperialistic relationship. They want the cotton that India grows because, you know, they are in an industrial revolution in the textile industry in Britain. But Britain is a small island. They don't have a lot of land. That's why they have such a great navy. They use the seas to extend their dominance and the power. And they need other colonies for resources for this industrial revolution. But the Indians in India increasingly want independence from Britain. They're frustrated with the Paris Peace settlement that did not include independence for those colonies. So in 1930, well, let's go back to 1919. So there is, of course, uprising in India. We've talked about some of those, and we talked about the workers when they had to bite off the gunpowder compartment and it was animal fat and they were told it wasn't. We talked about that already. But there's a lot of uprising that leads to kind of a modified self-rule. It doesn't work because there's just no agreement among the leaders of exactly how they want to lead. The Muslims don't cooperate because the one I was just referring to, the incident in the rifle factory, those were a combination of the Indian people and the Muslim people who were vegetarians that did not want animal products in their mouth. But when it came to political unification, the Muslims and the Indians were not on the same page. Whoops. So there is conflict of how we want to be independent. They both want independence. It is just they want different results with that independence. So the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League want one same end, but they want different means and different results with that independence. So Gandhi, he becomes the leader of the Indian National Congress. He's from a very wealthy Hindu family. He studied law in London. He fights for Indian rights in South Africa for 25 years. But when you say he fights, he fights with words and strikes. He embraces non-violence. He returns to India and leads a non-violent movement for independence. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he is the head of the Muslim League. So he knows that they all want independence. First of all, they are not really into the whole nonviolence thing. So he proposes that when we have independence, we have two states, a Muslim one and a Hindu one. And so eventually that is what happens. And there is the creation of Pakistan. with that came some conflict in and of itself. So they achieved this independence of India. They carve out a second nation, Pakistan. So that did not mean that everyone who was Muslim and everyone who was a Hindu lived in the right borders. And so there was some forced movement of people to go live within the right borders of whichever religion you were of. And here's some pictures of these people. Okay. I have a few minutes left. I'm going to talk about Africa. So I'm probably not going to get too much of the Latin American done today. I'll touch on it briefly when we meet again, because I will have some extra time then as well. We'll have another 1.5-hour meeting next time. So many African participated in World War I just because they were colonies of the countries that were fighting. But after the war, the idea of self-determination gained acceptance in the African nations. And when that rumor starts to form, the European imperialists want to tighten control. They do not want to lose their African colonies because they're very important to their economy and their worldwide trade. They're going to lose some money, basically. It's going to affect the wealth of the nations that own them. So there's a new class in Africa. This PowerPoint here refers to them as urban intellectuals. They're the new African elite. So just a quick touch on what that is. So when the larger countries imperialized and colonized the African countries, there are some people in Africa that travel to the other countries and are educated, and then they come back to Africa. So I don't know how to, I'm not saying this as a positive thing because they were colonized, their resources were taken advantage of. But there were some opportunities for those people in Africa to go to Europe to have this education. They come back, they're the new African elite, and they want to lead a movement in African identity and calling for independence. So they embrace this nation state as the best model for resisting colonialism. So this is similar. If you think back to where did we have city-states before? It was back in ancient Greece, where each one has its own identity culturally, and they're a little bit separated, but they're all have like a self-governing rule and have one common factor. We're one big area that wants all those little areas to get out, those controlling nations. And so that's such a broad definition that there's, of course, differing opinions on how this should be organized. Should we divide up by ethnic lines, like geographically where lines should be, like rivers, mountain ranges? Should we divide by languages? Some call for something called Pan-Africanism, led by Marcus Garvey. I think this was actually a question on your homework in the text, that all Africans are one big nation, kind of like the United States, and then we'll have states. All right, just to get through this really quickly, because you do need some more details on this, I realize that, but this is our overview for today. Nationalism also spreads into Latin America. They also have been victims of colonization. After World War I, the Latin American regions achieve independence, neo-colonialism or after colonialism. Again, we've got economic domination, don't want to lose our colonies, so there's military intervention. So this mainly comes from the US and Great Britain. US implements something called the Good Neighbor Policy. These Latin American countries are our closest neighbors. We want to keep good relations. We want to take our militaries over there and train their militaries how to protect themselves, which in return protects US interests in the country and economy. So the US actually encourages US companies, the government encourages US companies and banks to invest in Latin American countries who have claimed their independence. We've mentioned none of the people who led these independence movements, but I'll circle back to that when I have more time. And so these interventions lead to problems in Nicaragua, in Mexico, the United Fruit Company. It's a really interesting story that I will touch on, but I'm finishing up here. Today, I've talked for almost an hour and a half, which I know is a very long time for you to pay attention and take notes. So please do not forget to complete your note sheets because we will eventually have a test that you will need this information. All right, so next week is spring break, so you have off. I will finish up some more time on the individual Latin American revolutions next class, and then we will talk about World War II. So I've already talked about the discussion and your homework is listed. So I will see you at the next class. Thank you. Bye, guys.